Today, we dive deep into one of the most significant intellectual debates on race and justice: James Baldwin versus Paul Weiss. This isn't just any debate. It is a confrontation between two fundamentally opposing worldviews, one that understands race as an institutional force that defines opportunity, and another that sees it as an incidental factor, dismissing its significance in determining one's fate. On one side, we have James Baldwin, renowned writer, activist, and one of the most articulate voices in the struggle for black liberation. Baldwin did not merely theorize about race, he lived its harsh realities. Growing up in Harlem during the height of segregation, witnessing police brutality and experiencing firsthand the way black existence was policed and controlled, he carried the scars of systemic oppression. But Baldwin also carried with him an unshakable intellectual clarity, one that allowed him to dissect white supremacy with precision and force. And then there is Paul Weiss, a philosopher known for his abstract reasoning and universalist approach to human affairs. His argument is one we have heard many times before and still hear today: that individuals determine their own fate, that race is not a primary factor in success, and that people rise and fall based on merit alone. Weiss represents the intellectual position that denies the systemic nature of racism, reducing it instead to a personal struggle rather than an ingrained social structure. This discussion is not just a relic of the past. The ideological battle Baldwin and Weiss engaged in is one that continues to this day. The question of whether racism is an individual problem or a deeply embedded structural issue is at the heart of modern debates about inequality. It manifests in discussions about wealth, disparity, policing, education, political representation, and even the criminal justice system. It is a debate that plays out in different forms across Africa, the Caribbean, Europe, and the Americas, wherever the legacies of colonialism, slavery, and segregation continue to shape reality. When Baldwin speaks, he is not simply addressing Weiss. He is addressing centuries of erasure, the deep wounds of racial injustice, and the unfulfilled promises of democracy for black people. He is exposing the system that traps generations in cycles of poverty, limits access to education, and weaponizes the law to maintain inequality. And most importantly, he is challenging the world to see that racism is not an abstract issue. It is a lived experience with real consequences. This is why this debate remains relevant. Baldwin's arguments remain as sharp and necessary today as they were then. We see them reflected in ongoing movements: #Black Lives Matter, #EndSARS, reparations debates, land reform struggles, and the continuous fight for true independence in former colonies. In today's Reaction and Breakdown, we will take this debate apart, piece by piece. We will expose the hidden assumptions, challenge the contradictions, and bring this historical moment into direct conversation with the present. Because the past is never truly past, it is alive in the struggles we continue.
For each one of us, I think all this talk about poverty, race, prejudice is important, vital, but it's not really at the center. It deals only with the means in the way, or the obstacles in the way of becoming something much more serious and important. That is, to be someone in yourself. To become a man is a difficult job. It takes a lifetime.
I don't disagree with that at all.
I didn't think you would.
But I take that for granted. I really do.
That, you see, but by taking it for granted, you emphasize always the obstacles in the way, and perhaps you have it in mind, but I think your hearers very often forget that you have another objective in view, the one we both agree upon.
Is what I'm talking about.
I thought Dick was asking that question before when he asked you, aren't you being more extreme? Isn't there some other end? Is it all hopeless? In one sense, it is not hopeless. In another sense, it is. It's hopeless in the sense that nobody ever attains the state of being a full man. But it's not hopeless in the sense that every one of us has a problem which he can resolve more or less within himself. These obstacles are terrible, I agree with you, but they're not insuperable if you're
not talking about that. I understand that.
I know you're not.
I understand that. But as we sit here now, by the will of the people, a man named Ronald Reagan governs California. And the terms I'm using, you must understand, are not the terms that I myself might choose. I'm not interested in whether a person is white or black or green or yellow, but I'm talking about the force of the state which at this moment is oppressing black people all over this nation.
Not all.
The force of the state which is oppressing every black man in this nation.
You write freely, don't you not? Is black getting in your way as being a writer, an author?
Yes.
It is? Tell us how. I'd like to know how being black gets in the way of your being an author.
In the first place, now you put me a little bit on the spot.
I
don't like to discuss myself or my work.
All right, let's not talk about you. Let's talk about some other black author or white author.
No, let's not do it that way. I'll tell you what I mean. I'll use myself. Let's go for broke. It is The first difficulty, then, is to, and you will say this is true for everybody, but I, unlike you, all right? In the first place, I have to deal with the fact that my history is inaccessible to me. That my history in this country begins with the bill of sale.
Your individual history?
My name is Baldwin.
Yes.
It's an old English name.
That. My name is Weiss, and it's been derived from somebody else. Maybe my great ancestor was white-haired or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah, but you have at least the Psalms of David.
I don't have them. I don't think I've read them in 10 years.
That doesn't matter.
Or 20. I couldn't tell you one of them.
That doesn't matter.
Doesn't it?
No, it doesn't. One's got to face this fact. Let us say we're both black, right? We both get here at the same time, right? You come from one tribe, I come from another. You speak one language, I speak another. We cannot talk to each other. We don't know what is happening to us. We're confronting a white man with a Bible and a gun and a cross. And what you have to do, if you're going to live, is accept this stranger, this book you cannot yet read, under the gun. Wait a moment. You asked me a question. I'll do my best to answer it.
Yes, but you must give me a chance to say something,
yeah,
too.
But one moment.
All right.
One moment. I will. I really will. I'm not trying to.
Can I do something even more unforgivable? Because due to the mechanics, if we don't pause now, we may not be back for a while. So we will, and then we'll be back. Stay with us. Gentlemen, where were we?
I was in the middle of the Psalms of David.
Yes.
Right?
It's attributed to me somehow.
But I was trying to make a point. The point is this simply, that one began here with a history of an identity, not only inaccessible, but also systematically and deliberately denied and destroyed. The Moynihan Report talks about the breakup of the Negro family, and it occurs to me as a very bitter kind of comment on the people who did their best to break up that family, now to blame the family for being broken up. And to suggest
he wasn't doing that, the report I read. Okay.
Well, there are no male father images for the Negro child. Big news.
But he was trying to
describe in the first place, that's not as true as Moynihan would like to think. Otherwise, there would be none of us here at all. The point is that, then, we come back to where I was. One has to really excavate out of the absence of a history, and then out of the presence of a history which is absolutely indescribable. You must remember that I was taught, and black children until today are being taught, that no black people ever contributed anything to history, that I was not much better than an ape, and I was lucky to be discovered in Africa by white people.
Mr. Baldwin, but if your case were carried out all the way through the way you're putting it, it'd be hard to understand how you ever wrote a word. After all, you're a distinguished novelist. You must have had time of freedom. Somebody must have paid attention to it. You must have been reviewed objectively as an author, not as a Negro. Nobody gave a damn whether your great ancestor had been bought or sold, but they treated your literature or your work in its own terms. That's where you wanted it. That's where you had it. That's where you're having it now. What are you criticizing? What are you objecting to? That there are terrible injustices, everyone admits. But you're generalizing and you're rigidifying and you're solidifying it in such a way as if there's no way out. You're an exhibition of the fact there's a way out.
Am I?
Yes. You yourself admitted. You're not just the incarnation of blackness. You're an author. That's why I think of you.
I beg your pardon. I am also the oldest of 9 children, all of whom are black. I am one of the few survivors of my generation, all of whom the people I'm speaking of are black. For every Jimmy Baldwin or Sammy Davis or Harry Belafonte or Sidney Poitier, there are a whole lot of people you never heard of, at least equally talented, perhaps more talented, who did not manage. I'll tell you how one makes it in this country if you're black. You have to decide somehow that you are not going to be controlled by what white people think of you.
Of course. What anybody thinks of you, ultimately you have to think of yourself and be true to yourself.
I don't care what Senator Eastland thinks about me.
Who cares?
Or Ronald Reagan thinks about me, but they have the power to destroy my life and the life of my children, and this is given them by the will of the state. I'm not talking about myself as a writer. Of course I'm a writer. I know that. I know what produced me, too. And it was not simply Charles Dickens or any of your colleges. It was also Bessie Smith and Ray Charles and my father, who was a preacher, and my mother, who learned how to sing.
That's true of anybody who's a writer.
What I am trying to say is that the gap, the distance placed between myself and my own assessment, my own experience, was much greater than it would be for any white person in this country.
I don't believe it.
I know you don't believe it.
We don't.
I'm not complaining. I'm not copying a plea. It's not a special plea. I'm trying to make you see something. Pretend that I'm an actor.
Child starts from scratch. They are helped in various exterior ways in order to be able to find themselves. But the finding of themselves goes within. To become a writer is something that you have to struggle with by yourself, in yourself. And all these other things are conditions and problems, and I grant you had more than other people have.
I didn't even say that. I said they were different.
At any rate, everybody, no matter who, no matter what his attitude, is bigoted.
I did not say that.
Well, has an attitude. It's on his face. Is in the way of every boss.
But you're
every
asking
boss.
me. You're asking me to do something impossible. You're asking me to take the will for the deed.
Baldwin's most powerful points is that racism isn't just about individual bias. It's a system that dictates where black people live, the education they receive, the jobs they can get, and the rights they can exercise. Weiss, like many who resist acknowledging systemic racism, argues that success is a matter of personal struggle, that if one works hard enough, one can rise above their circumstances. But Baldwin challenges this notion by exposing the deep institutional forces that maintain racial hierarchies. It's not just about trying harder. It's about the fact that, for centuries, black people have been deliberately placed at a disadvantage. Let's look at this in real terms. Housing discrimination, for example, wasn't just a social preference, it was a legal practice. In the US, redlining ensured that black families were denied home ownership opportunities that built generational wealth for white families. Employment. Black workers are often pushed into low-wage, unstable jobs, and even when they acquire higher education, they face disproportionate discrimination in hiring and promotion. This is what Baldwin means when he says that black people are not merely struggling against individual bigotry, but against an entire social order designed to limit their progress. Weiss insists that individuals, not society, determine their fate. His argument assumes that Baldwin, by virtue of his success, has disproven the notion of systemic oppression. But this is a dangerous misunderstanding of how oppression works. Yes, Baldwin made it, but at what cost? He left the United States in 1948 with nothing but $40 and the certainty that staying could kill him, not just physically but spiritually. His survival as a writer was not proof that racism was non-existent, it was proof of his ability to navigate a world stacked against him. The reality is, systemic oppression does not mean that success is impossible. It means that success comes at an extraordinary cost for black people. The emotional labor, the constant need to prove oneself, the fear of failing not just for oneself but for an entire race. These are burdens that white individuals do not carry. And let's be clear, one person's success does not negate the suffering of millions. We see this logic used all the time. Barack Obama becoming president didn't erase racism. Oprah Winfrey's wealth didn't eliminate poverty among black communities. The existence of successful black individuals does not disprove systemic barriers. It highlights the extraordinary lengths required to overcome them. Baldwin speaks about fear, not paranoia, but real, tangible fear. The fear of being denied opportunities. The fear of being policed. The fear of simply existing in a world that does not value black life. He describes how leaving America released him from this fear, not because racism didn't exist elsewhere, but because, in America, it was institutionalized to an extreme degree. This is a sentiment many in the African diaspora can relate to, whether escaping Jim Crow America, apartheid South Africa, or colonial rule. Black people have often found it necessary to leave their homelands in search of basic human dignity. But why should we have to leave? Why should we have to prove our humanity in the first place? Baldwin's words are a reminder that survival should not be a victory, it should be a given. One of Baldwin's most striking observations is that racism doesn't just exist in the minds of individuals, it exists in the very structures that govern society. This is a critical distinction. Racism is not merely about personal prejudice. It is embedded in institutions that determine who gets access to power, resources, and opportunity. Baldwin breaks it down masterfully. He doesn't need to ask whether white people personally hate black people. That's irrelevant. What matters is the way the system itself is designed to keep black people in a permanent state of disadvantage. Think about it. A segregated church, where Christianity is divided by race, a religion that claims to be about unity and love, has for centuries operated on racial divisions. Even after slavery, white churches actively excluded black people, leading to the creation of separate black churches, not as a choice, but as a necessity. Today, that legacy remains, with predominantly black and white congregations existing separately, reflecting deeper societal divides. Labor unions that exclude black workers. Organized labor has historically fought for workers' rights, but not always for black workers. Many unions in the US and Europe were explicitly racist, barring black people from high-paying jobs and skilled trades. Even today, black workers are disproportionately stuck in low-wage, unstable jobs with fewer protections. A real estate industry that confines black families to ghettos. Housing discrimination wasn't just a product of social attitudes, it was law. Redlining policies in the U.S. ensured that black families were denied mortgages in wealthier neighborhoods, forcing them into overcrowded, underfunded areas. Similar tactics were used in South Africa under apartheid and in colonial cities across Africa and the Caribbean, where white settlers lived in luxury while black people were relegated to impoverished districts. The wealth gap we see today is a direct result of these policies, an education system that deliberately miseducates black children. From the colonial era to the present, black children have been systematically denied quality education. Under segregation, black schools were intentionally underfunded. In post-colonial Africa and the Caribbean, education systems were built around European curriculums, erasing local histories and perspectives. Even today, in predominantly black nations, elite schools prioritize European languages and Western ideologies over indigenous knowledge. The result, a system that teaches black children to see themselves as. Baldwin saw this clearly, and his refusal to trust white institutions is not about resentment, it's about logic. Why should black people trust a system that has, for centuries, only worked against them? This is the heart of institutional racism. It's not about whether white individuals harbor hatred. It's about the fact that even if they don't, the system still does. So, where does that leave us? Baldwin refuses to rely on idealism. He demands evidence. He demands action, and so should we. The struggle he spoke of is not just an American issue, it is a global reality. From police killings in the US to economic exploitation in Africa, from anti-blackness in Latin America to the marginalization of black communities in Europe, the fight against systemic racism continues. Consider the movements happening today. #Black Lives Matter US, a movement that exposed police brutality, racialized mass incarceration, and the ongoing economic oppression of black Americans. #EndSARS, Nigeria, a rebellion against police violence, where young Nigerians demanded an end to the Special Anti-Robbery Squad SARS, a unit notorious for brutality and extrajudicial killings. Land reform in South Africa, a push to correct the historical theft of African land by European settlers, a legacy that still leaves black South Africans economically disadvantaged today. Anti-colonial movements in the Caribbean. Nations like Jamaica and Barbados are demanding reparations from Britain for centuries of slavery and economic exploitation. All of these struggles prove that the systems Baldwin criticized are still alive. They may look different, but their function remains the same: to maintain racial and economic hierarchies that keep black people at the bottom. And this is where Baldwin's words become a call to action. He tells us plainly we cannot afford to wait for systems to change on their own. History has shown us that power does not willingly relinquish itself. It must be challenged. It must be dismantled. So, what must be done? We must reclaim our history. Our stories cannot be told by those who oppress us. We need to teach our children their real history, not just slavery, but the empires of Mali, the brilliance of Timbuktu, the revolutions of Haiti, the intellectuals of the Harlem Renaissance. We must demand economic justice. Political freedom means nothing without economic power. This means supporting black businesses, advocating for land reforms, and fighting against predatory global economic policies that continue to drain Africa and the Caribbean of their wealth. We must build our own institutions. Baldwin reminds us that no system built by oppressors will ever truly serve the oppressed. The future lies in black-owned media, black-led schools, and economic networks that prioritize black prosperity. James Baldwin's debate with Paul Weiss remains one of the most important discussions on race, power, and oppression, and the sad reality: the issues he raised are still with us today. His words force us to ask difficult questions. What systems are we still fighting against? How do we dismantle them? And most importantly, how do we ensure that future generations do not have to keep fighting the same battles? This is a conversation that needs to continue. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Have you seen these dynamics play out in your own country or community? Let's talk about it. If you found this discussion valuable, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let's keep the momentum going. Until next time, stay empowered and stay informed.